The T2 Plus, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview before I get into the review. This is a single dynamic driver earphone, costs around 60 bucks. It's Tin Hifi's latest in the T2 line, which if you've been following things, they've got a good thing going. The T2, the T2 Pro, I actually like the T2 Pro, the T3, T4. They've got a lot of earphones in this line, and this is their latest. So like I mentioned, 60 bucks, so pretty squarely in the budget territory. And so what I've done over the past week is I've been listening to the T2 Plus, and I've been comparing it to some other budget killers, right? So, you know, what are the things that I really compared it to? I called it out in the headline, so I might as well mention it right away. One of the earphones that I wanted to compare this to is the Blon BL-03, very popular budget earphone. Not necessarily my favorite tuning, but I understand why that one is so popular. Also compared it, of course, to the original Tin Hifi T2, as well compared it to the Moondrop SSR, which I recently reviewed and quite liked. So, just to kind of set the stage, that's where we're at here with the T2 Plus. Now, this is a live review. If you're watching in the live stream or watching the live stream and you're in the live chat, feel free to start asking questions. I'm gonna go ahead and power through this review, and then at the end of the review, I'm gonna go ahead and engage with you guys in live chat, answer your questions, follow up on anything that I didn't quite get to, that I might not have mentioned, might not have answered your question in the original review or just in the regular base review. But I'm just kind of rambling right now, so let's go ahead and get into talking about this earphone. And like I typically do, we're gonna start by talking about the build of the Tin Hifi T2 Plus. And you can see I've got it surrounded beautifully by those earphones that I talked about comparing it to. But for now, let's focus on the T2 Plus. So build-wise, there's actually quite a lot pretty good going on here, especially for a budget IEM, in my opinion at least. You know, well, we can start with this cable, which is, I think, a really quite nice cable. You can see that it lies flat. Maybe you could quibble that it is a tad on the kinky side. I don't know if that's really coming through, but that's if you're really quibbling. But for the most part, it's just a really nice, soft cable. You got a straight 3.5 millimeter jack here at the one end. You've got a somewhat functional chin slider. Yeah, I would say this is somewhat functional. I mean, it's definitely functional. It'll stay up, but you can see that it's relatively loose. And when the earphones are sort of packed up like this, it'll slide itself down. But when you're wearing them, I would say that thing is squarely functional. And then of course you've got preformed ear hooks up here and not 3.5, you've got MMCX connectors, which is just like what Tin Hifi has put on their other earphones. It seems like Tin Hifi, I don't know, it seems like the 2-pin versus MMCX tends to follow like brand favorites, right? Tin Hifi tends to prefer MMCX. Companies like Moondrop tend to prefer 2-pin. What do I prefer? I don't really care that much, but I kind of prefer MMCX. Anyway, so that's the cable, right? And then we can get to talking about the buds. And I think that, I don't know, I think these are really nicely machined pieces for a $60 IEM. Kind of reminds me of the build that you see on much more expensive IEMs like the Eco OH1. Even something like, what am I thinking of? I forgot the name of the Simgot EN 700 something. The build is very similar to that, right? It's just kind of this machined aluminum shell, smooth all the way around. The stems I find are a little bit on the short side, and because of that, the fit in my ear is not especially deep. It's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think a lot of people, especially if you're just getting into the IEM game, a shallow fitting stem is actually probably preferable, but it does mean that it's maybe not quite as secure as something like the Moondrop SSR, which has just got a little bit of a deeper fit. The bigger issue that I actually ended up having with the fit, and this is kind of surprising given how round and smooth this shape is I actually ended up getting sort of a pressure point down here in my ear if I wear this thing for, you know, over half an hour. Under half an hour, I don't have any issues, but if I, you know, wear this thing for about 30 minutes to an hour or something like that, I'll just start to feel a bit of discomfort down here. And that's probably particular to my ear, but worth mentioning. That is about as much as I can talk about the build. I mean, I did mention during the unboxing that the tips that this thing comes with are actually on the nice side of tip quality, so that's nice. You don't have to worry about getting any different tips. I found that they, you know, nice quality feel, they sealed well, fit well, generally pretty happy with it. And this is exactly how I listen to this earphone. I didn't have to do any customization of my own. So overall, I'm pretty happy with the build. We can do, you know, I don't typically do a lot of comparisons of build in my reviews. Usually I focus on the sound, but we can compare them a little bit. The Blon BL-03, you know, kind of notorious for its fit, which is good for some people, not great for some people. For me, the Blon BL-03 actually fits great, and I would say that this is an easier fit for me and a more comfortable fit than the T2 Plus. Even though it's got pretty similar design and probably pretty similar nozzle length. The T2 original, fit-wise, these are pretty different. In fact, I think that the T2 original fit is probably one of the weaker parts of this earphone, and I think the fit generally is better here on the T2 Pro, or the Plus, sorry. There's a lot of T2s, right? Just the way that that thing fits into my ear snugly and easily, I prefer that. But then we get here to the Moondrop SSR, and of all of these, the SSR is my favorite fitting IEM. It's just so small. It's got slightly long nozzle, so I'm able to get a relatively deep ear fit with that. And I like that. So yeah, that is the build of the Tin Hifi T2 Plus. And again, if there's something I didn't mention that you have a question about, feel free to ask it in the live chat and I'll get to you in just a second. But before we do that, let's talk about the sound of the T2 Plus. And this is actually the most surprising thing. So as surprising as it was that Tin Hifi made a T2 that didn't look like their other T lines, the most surprising thing to me, honestly, is the sound. And just given what Tin Hifi has done with their other IEMs, they tend to be sort of neutral, bright sounding earphones. I kind of expected that here, especially if you look on their website, on Tin Hifi's website, they have one. Not every IEM company has a website. Tin Hifi actually does, and they describe these as like a studio tuned earphone, so I kind of expected it would be very similar, but I think what you get here is actually a lot more of a mainstream sound, and I don't say that as a negative, because I think this is the sort of IEM that's going to appeal to a broad audience, but as well, it's going to appeal to audio nerds like us. So overall sound signature, I would describe this as a very mild V sound with a relatively flat mid-range. You got a little bit of an upper mid-range boost, but really the dominant characteristics of the sound are slightly elevated treble and slightly elevated bass, maybe more than slightly elevated bass. And that's actually why I called out the Blon BL-03 in the headline of this video, is that immediately the sound of this thing reminded me of the Blon in terms of that bass impact. Now, the bass presence on the T2 Plus is definitely not as elevated as it is on the Blon, and for that reason, I think a lot of people are still gonna like the Blon better, but for me, what I loved about the Blon BL-03 is just the punch in that bass, the way that it hits, and the dimensionality that it adds to the sound that's so much stronger than what you get with most budget IEMs. And I think the T2 Plus does that. And it does it, I think, better because it doesn't have the same overemphasis in the bass. There's still emphasized bass for sure. And I would describe the bass here as sort of a wideband boost, where it's not just sub-bass focused like you might get on something like the Starfield, or even like the Tin Hifi T4, which is, I think, more sub-bass focused. Here, the bass is more mid-bass into sub-bass. And that wideband boost just gives it a really nice body and a really nice kick that's very, very satisfying. And I think most people are gonna really love the bass on this IEM. If you want more bass, yeah, you can get the Blon. But if you've tried something like the Tin Hifi T2 and you're disappointed with that amount of bass, I can understand you, and I think you'll be totally satisfied here. I did mention that the treble has got a bit of elevation, and that's actually probably where I would have my biggest issue with the T2 Plus. Not that I don't like elevated treble. In fact, I tend to prefer elevated treble, as you probably know. But there is a bit of sharpness in the lower treble region, I think, which I actually don't mind too much. For me, the bigger issue is that this earphone tends towards sibilance, at least in my experience, listening to things like Erasure or Men I Trust. These are vocals that are relatively forward, and I guess they're very SE vocals. And on some earphones, look, it's not unique to this earphone necessarily, but some earphones can handle the sibilance well. The T2 Plus is, in my experience, not necessarily one of them. So that is probably the biggest downside here with this earphone. Let's go into a little bit more comparisons. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's roughly the character of the T2 Plus, right? It's relatively flat mid-range with elevated bass, elevated treble. You know, one thing that's worth mentioning that I didn't really get to a ton is, you know, that bass character that I described. What that really does is it gives this earphone, I think, especially good imaging and soundstage. For a $60 IM, I can't really think of anything that images and soundstages better than the T2 Plus. But let's go ahead and talk about some comparisons. And so I'll talk about the T2, the original T2. I think that versus the T2 Plus, this is actually more treble focused, and I think similarly has, you know, some issues with sibilance with some songs. But I think overall this is actually a more trebly earphone, and probably a lot of that is going to come down to the fact that the T2 Plus has got so much more bass presence that the treble emphasis here stands out more. I think there's also less upper mid-range lift on the T2, the original T2 versus the Plus model. And what that has the effect of is I think that vocals come actually a little bit more forward here on the Plus model, whereas on the original T2, the mid-range I would describe as more closer to a flat sound signature. But yeah, I think overall tonality-wise, I think this is a lot more engaging and a lot more fun. Tonally-wise, I think that it's a more natural sort of organic sound, whereas this is a little bit more of a leaner, cleaner, neutral sound. This is still a very lean sound, don't get me wrong, especially when you compare it to something like the Blon, but overall this is a leaner sound that's much less the bass emphasis, and for a lot of people, I know that that's been an issue with the T2 recommendation, and so that's why my $50 recommendations have been T2 or Blon if you want bass. But now, well, let's go ahead and bring in the Blon. That's why I described this video, or why I described this earphone as the Blon killer, is because, again, my recommendation was this, or if you want bass, get this. But my recommendation is, if you want bass, get the T2 Plus. And it's not that this has as much bass as the Blon. If you want more bass, there's still a good, very, very good argument for the Blon BL-03. I just think that tonally, the BL-03 is a little bit on the warm side for my personal preferences. I think that the lower mid-range, I don't want to say that the bass bleeds into the lower mid-range, but the lower mid-range is just a little bit on the fuzzy side, whereas here with the T2 Plus, man, it's a good thing I'm not editing this video, because I would have to be editing the names of this thing quite a bit, probably. Anyway, what I was trying to say is that just the lower mid-range forwardness on this earphone, I think prevents it from sounding as crystalline clear as you get here with the T2 Plus. Just a little bit warm, a little bit foggy tonally, but overall this is still, I think, a really good option. And if you want more bass, you can obviously pick the BL-03, but if you want, I think, the best bass, I would give the best bass to the T2 Plus. So now let's go ahead and talk about the Moondrop SSR, which I reviewed recently. I gave this thing 5 stars and I still quite love it. But I will also say that in that review, I talked about wanting to love this earphone just because of the build and the physical characteristics and how well this thing fits my ear. I probably am a little bit more lenient on the sound characteristics, which versus here are actually quite different. And there's some things that I think that the SSR does better, but I think for most people, most people are gonna very clearly prefer the T2 Plus. So let's just go ahead and set the stage. The big differences here obviously are the bass. If you are at all concerned that bass is a thing that you need, I would steer away from the SSR. I think the bass is actually really well done. Between these two, like the bass body, I much prefer here on the T2 Pro, but bass volume, I actually prefer it here. It's, you know, it's got a decent little punch to it, but what it does is it leaves, I think, a little bit more room for the mid-range and the resolution of the mid-range to come out. Now, the other big difference is the pinna gain here on the SSR. There's a lot in the upper mid-range, so, you know, 3K hertz. Not that 3K hertz necessarily means much to most people, but what that means is that, you know, the vocals come forward pretty far with the SSR, and I find it pretty enjoyable. Again, most of my music that I listen to is very vocal heavy, so that makes sense. I think that tonally wise, this is definitely going to be more most people's cup of tea. But there's still a pretty good argument for the SSR in my opinion, and I think that the tuning here is just generally, you know, they call references in the name of the title, which just means that they're going for a relatively flat sound signature that ostensibly would be a good place to start if you were creating reference material. And between the two, you know, I think with my slight EQ, I generally prefer, I think that this thing is a smoother sound. Like that treble emphasis that you get here gives the T2 Pro, T2 Plus, there I did it again. That treble emphasis gives this a nice bit of sparkle in the top end, but does come at the expense of slightly sibilant vocals, whereas I don't get that issue here with the SSR. I think that the treble generally actually kind of rolls off on the SSR and can be a little bit dull because of that, but you don't get issues with sibilance, so that's sort of the trade-off. I don't know if I'm going to rank these. Wow, I wasn't prepared to rank these, but I just said it, so I feel like I gotta rank them. In terms of my personal preference, these ones are going to be hard to separate, so it's going to be these two, these, and these. Does that make sense? It's going to be hard for me to pick between the T2 Pro and the Moondrop SSR because I think they both do things really, really well, and they do different things really, really well. Then I think the T2, and then here is the Blon. Now I think what most people's preference is going to be, it's going to be actually a little bit different. I think this is what most people's preference is going to be. I think a lot of people are going to prefer the Blon BL-03, and a lot of people are going to prefer the resolution and more, I guess, analytical sound. It's slightly more analytical than this just because this kind of comes across a little bit on the foggy side because of that excess bass, in my opinion. But I think that the bass impact here is so satisfactory that most people that are looking for a nice bassy IM are going to be perfectly satisfied with that. Now next comes the Tin T2, and then I think the Moondrop SSR is probably going to be the least favorite just because, you know, the T2 has got a little bit more interest, I think, in the treble and the mid bass, which makes this thing stage, I think, better than the SSR. The SSR is maybe a little bit two-dimensional. But yeah, I don't know. That's roughly how I would describe the sound differences between these earphones. And so I might as well go ahead and wrap this thing up with a score. And so out of 5 stars, I would give the Tin Hifi T2 Plus all 5 stars. I think, again, from the build quality, that is just surprisingly good for the money. For 60 bucks, I can't really think of anything else except for maybe the Moondrop SSR. That really comes close. Yeah, there's a lot good there. I have a little bit of issues with the fit in terms of long-term comfort, but I think that's going to be particular to me because there's no obvious like sharp edges or anything on this. It's just kind of pressure points, and everyone's ear is different in that way. And then sound signature wise, the bass on this thing is, it's really quite nice. Like probably the next best bass presenting IM, at least that I've got in my collection, I would probably say is something like the JVC FD X1. I think that bass is better than this bass, but I can't really think of anything sub that price range that I've got in my collection that I like better than this in terms of that bass. So I'm pretty into it. The mid-range is not the emphasis here, but because it is relatively flat tuned, It does still come across pretty well. And the treble, it's got that little bit of sparkle, which can be occasionally an issue for some songs, some tracks. But for the most part, I think it contributes to a very, very good sounding IEM. So that is the Tin Hifi T2 Plus. If you're interested in checking this thing out, of course, I've got links in the description down below. If you like this video, hit the like button, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you're watching live now, we'll have a chat in the Q&A. If you're not watching live, ding the notification bell and YouTube will let you know next time I go live so that we can talk. For the rest of you, let's talk. All right, let me catch up with live chat as much as I can. This one's moving pretty quick, so I apologize if I don't get to everyone right away. Maria Pia, thank you. Salsa Man, they look really cool. I agree. I think this is a very cool looking IEM. Did you guys get a good enough look? Let's punch in. That is a good look. Nice and simple. No goofy branding on the outside. There is a little bit of Tin Hifi branding here on the top that is printed, but I think that is about the proper way to do branding on an IEM like this. Just my personal opinion. Not a big fan of logos. When Kern asking, have I tried out the advanced Model 3? Nope, I haven't tried that one. I'm somewhat aware of it, but I haven't tried it. Intuit review saying beats the 03 and the 05. Not sure about the SSR though. That's a different animal altogether. Yeah, I mean, I think, so obviously the title of this video is I think that this thing kills the Blon, which is maybe a bit of an overstatement because it's gonna depend on your preferences, honestly. For my preferences and my recommendations, this kind of knocks the Blon off my list. Not because I don't like the Blon, not because I don't think the Blon isn't going to be better for some people, but because for me, for my preferences, if I want a bassy IEM, not that this is even necessarily super bassy, but the bass presentation on this is so good that I think this qualifies as an IEM for folks that want bass. Which means I'm going to stop recommending the Blon BL-03. William Mendoka asking, will I ever review the Westone UM series? I don't know about the Westones. I feel like I have tried one Westone. A friend of mine has a pair and I don't remember anything about them except that I really like the fit. I love the fit of Westones. Very similar to Shure's, just kind of like that bean shape that plugs in your ear really well. I wish more IEMs fit like that. Donsploitation saying, had mine for a couple of days now and really enjoying them. I love how small it is and how it fits so well for me. Yeah, so Don, I'm actually pretty interested to hear from other folks that have spent some time with the T2 Plus. Does anybody else have the pressure point issue that I have? Because I feel like it's the sort of thing that is uniquely me. And I have to mention it because it's my experience, but I don't want to say that this is an issue with this IEM. It's just a thing with me. And well, it'd be good to get some other outside opinions. On that note, Intuit actually mentioned, I agree, I also had fit issues after long listening sessions. Pressure point for me as well. Interesting, okay. So that's something to look out for. Again, for me, it really only popped up after listening for over half an hour, and it didn't make it unbearable or anything like that. It was just slightly uncomfortable. I was still able to effectively sleep in the T2 Plus. I have to think really hard every time I say that name. I kind of wish they went with a different number. Maybe the T2.5 or something like that. T2 Plus though. Hiran Patel saying, I ordered these from Linsol a week ago. Still going to take another 2 to 3 weeks to get. Oh no. That is an unfortunate downside with the state of the shipping industry right now. If you could find something on, I don't know if you're in the US or not, but if you're in the US, if you can find something on Amazon, the Amazon stocks in the local warehouse, that is nice, but there's a lot of really good stuff out there right now that unfortunately is not stocked by Amazon, and we are having to deal with those long ship times. Interestingly, I actually did get my own Moondrop SSR. So this is an SSR that I actually bought for myself. I got a review unit that had, well, I just wanted another cable. So I bought one when it became available, before it went away from not being available, and actually got that fairly quickly. I was actually pretty surprised by that. So maybe there's a good chance. I guess here, and what I'm trying to say is maybe there's some hope that it'll actually get to you sooner than you think, but maybe not. Sorry. Adam Mobius saying, I'm having a bit of fit issues with the T2 Plus after long listening to a sort of sore feeling from the pressure. That's okay. All right, so I'm glad I mentioned it. This is definitely something you should consider when, picking any IEM. Honestly, again, everyone's ear shape is very different. IEMs that fit me well are not going to be guaranteed to fit you well. And I've known this from like very firsthand experience. I've swapped IEMs with people in person, and IEMs that fit me great just don't fit into other people's ears. And then other IEMs that they love don't necessarily fit me. So, I mean, this is a bit of a pattern, so something to consider, but again, your mileage may vary. William Mendoka is asking, will I try any American-made IEMs? And so the answer to that question is, I think the only American-made IEM that I have in my collection are the 2 acoustic models, and I did reviews of those. They are sort of studio reference tuned IEMs, so very bass light. If you're into bass, those are not great, but I actually quite like the resolution, the mid-range resolution on those acoustics. I have that review. I published it about a year ago. But yeah, apart from that, what are the other American brands? Most of them are pretty expensive, frankly, right? You've got Campfire Audio, relatively expensive. And I have spent a little bit of time with, I think it was the Campfire Lyra 2, is that right? That sounds right. Wasn't necessarily my bag. It was a bit bassy, but yeah, I don't know. American-made IEMs, not a ton on my radar just because they tend to be a little bit more expensive than most of the stuff I look at. I guess when I say a little bit more expensive than what I look at, it's like more expensive than I am open to taking a chance on, if that makes sense, right? If I have to spend my own money to buy an IEM, I gotta kind of hope that I had to have a pretty good idea that it's gonna be what I want. And if it's a couple $100 and it turns out to be disappointing, that sucks. You guys know the feeling. Try and catch up a little bit. El Jefe, what's up? Wara Samir asking, would I say that these are more balanced than the typical KZs and TRNs? And in my opinion, yes. So that's actually why I really loved the fact that the Blon BL-03 came onto the scene, and it was so well done for a bassy IEM that I kind of stopped recommending anything by KZ and TRN. Not that like I have anything out for those companies. They make some pretty fun IEMs, and I had a lot of fun experimenting with their different IEMs and stuff like that, but they all had a little bit of tonal funkiness, and I don't think the Blon BL-03 has any funkiness in the tonality. Like, it sounds very natural and organic. It's just a little bit on the boomy side for my personal taste, but I think it's a very, very well done bassy IEM, and I think that this is similarly a well done bass that doesn't have any issues with tonality funkiness. So yeah, I can't think of any KZs that I've heard that I would rank in the same league as this. What's up, Keshan? Kenny? Kieran Patel asking, do I EQ if I don't like too much treble, and doesn't that work? So for the most part, I don't use a lot of EQ. Every once in a while I will, if I'm reviewing an IEM and there's a particular thing that I want to try and fix or change about the IEM, I will explore EQ a little bit. In fact, I mentioned with the Moondrop SSR, because I like that, I think I like it so much, but there's, the upper mid-range emphasis that I wanted to tame. I did play with EQ a little bit with that. I gotta be honest, I didn't actually play with EQ at all with the T2 Plus, and that's because I think tonally it's very, very good. Could I solve the sibilance issues with EQ In my experience, no. I'm sure it's possible, and it's probably gonna really depend on the quality of the EQ software that you're using. Typically, I'm just using my Walkman, which has got a basic 10-band EQ, and so I can like target 8K hertz, which is usually around, you know, where sibilants, I don't know, 8K hertz. Usually if you drop 8K, or if an IEM has some emphasis in 8K, that's kind of where, you know, you'll see the effect of sibilants. I actually didn't try it here with this, and that's just because I haven't in the past really had much success with affecting sibilants via EQ. Maybe it's just because of the imprecision of, you know, a basic 10-band EQ like this, or maybe it's just not totally down to tonality that that drives that sibilant. So maybe I should. I mention this kind of all the time. I have a Discord channel. I've got a link in the pinned comment below this video. If you want to join the Discord channel, please do, and I'll spend some time EQing and seeing if I can play around with, if I can have any effect on that sibilance, and I'll let you guys know in Discord. Fortunately, I feel like you would be pretty bored if I tried to do that right now. Adam Mobius asking SSR or T2 as your non-bass recommendation. So my personal preference is the SSR, and a lot of it honestly comes down to the fit and the build, which is not necessarily the answer that a lot of people like to hear, but that actually plays a big factor in how much I enjoy an IEM. So the build and the fit of the SSR I think is significantly better than the original Tin T2. Now in terms of sound signature, it's not quite as easy because they do different things. I think more people would prefer the T2. I think the T2 is actually a safer bet. It's got a little bit more mid-bass to it than the SSR, and I think that the upper mid-range is not so forward that it's not as much of a thin sounding IEM is maybe the best way to say it. The SSR is fairly thin sounding, very mid-range focused, and the T2 I think is more balanced. I think that it stages better as well. I think it's just a little bit more interesting and exciting because of that treble emphasis and that little bit of bass emphasis. And so I think most people are going to prefer the T2. Personal preference in terms of sound, I could honestly go either way, but because of those fit benefits, fit and build, my personal preference is the Moondrop SSR. Neji Hiyashi asking, I want something comfortable. What has the best fit for long usage? I mean, it really depends on how much you want to spend. If we're talking about these IEMs that I've been covering, the Moondrop SSR is, in my opinion, the best fitting of these 4 IEMs. Now, if you want to spend more money, there's other IEMs that I think fit even better than that. And I would say my ultimate best fitting IEMs are probably 2 that I've talked about before on the channel, the Shozi Cross Neo CP and the Maga OC K5. Both of those IEMs, they fit me like a glove. They plug in super easy. I love them. If you want long-term comfort fit, like the Shozi CP is what I took on a 20-hour flight to Thailand last year, just to kind of underscore how much I think those things are the most comfortable IEMs that I've got. Interesting. Intuit's adding, so Intuit Reviews, another IEM reviewer, he's posted a review of the T2 Plus as well. If you've got a link, I would encourage you to go ahead and post that link, share it with folks. But he's adding a little bit more details to his preference or his idea of the T2 Plus, saying that the T2 Plus has more bass quantity. The SSR has more textures and detail in the bass in it, even if it's back decibel wise. So I could maybe see that description applying. I think that my computer's making noise. I'm gonna have to mute this thing. Hold on. I could see that description applying. But I think overall, most people that are into bass are going to prefer the T2 Plus. Optato saying, I wouldn't consider the T2 Plus Blon killers. I would probably consider them a more refined Blon 03 if you stack their frequency response on top of each other. They're incredibly close from 500 to 16. Yeah, they're pretty similar. You know, the Blon very similarly has, you know, a bit of upper mid-range lift, but not as much as you would get on something like the Moondrop SSR, or even, you know, something like the Starfield. I think the Moondrop Starfield has even got more upper mid-range lift than what you'd get on something like the Blon. So I can see that comparison being fairly apt. Honestly, like, this is kind of what I was expecting from the Blon BL-05. You know, the BL-03 came out last year, very popular. Some people say it's too bassy. They come out with a new model. I expected, honestly, something kind of like this. And the BL-05 is okay. I haven't reviewed that one yet, but I'd probably give that one like a 3-star. It's not bad. It's actually, you know, it's pretty well done. The bass impact is still pretty nice. It's missing some of that organic quality that you get from the Blon and that I think you get here with the T2 Plus. Waris asking, which one is more sibilant, the SSR or the T2 Plus? In my opinion, the T2 Plus. I didn't have any issues really with sibilance on the SSR, and partly that's because I think the treble on that frankly kind of rolls off. You know, you get that upper mid-range lift and there's some lower treble emphasis because of that comes along with that. But after that, it kind of, you know, it lacks a bit of air and a little bit of that treble, you know, kind of interest and engagement that you get here. The side effect is I don't have any issues with sibilance with the SSR, and I do here, so it's, you know, it's a trade-off. Joshua Tolliver saying, interesting, hopefully they put the SSR back out. Yeah, so for those of you that don't know, I reviewed the Moondrop SSR a couple of weeks ago, and I reviewed it like 2 days before it went on sale, I think, and then I bought it. I bought another copy of it because I wanted that cable, and for me, 40 bucks to have that cable was worth it. But then like immediately afterward, it went off sale again. And it turns out that Moondrop, they cited some issues with the cable supplier or something like that. They were having some QC issues with their cables. Thankfully, not issues that I've had with either of my units, but I guess good on Moondrop to halt production and stop collecting money from people and fix their issue and hopefully go back on sale soon. The downside is that they said that it was going to be like a month or so, which is kind of a bummer. John Duggan asking, how does the Starfield and the K-Bear Diamond compare to the T2 Plus and the Blon? So I think that tonally wise, I actually prefer the T2 Plus, and I actually kind of prefer the Blon, frankly, to the Moondrop Moondrop Starfield. Yeah, I don't know. The Moondrop Starfield, I think it's a very, very nicely done IEM, but there's something about the mid-range on it that just kind of leaves me wanting. Whereas I think the mid-range here is perfectly satisfactory, not quite as satisfactory to my ear as the SSR, but nice mid-range tonality here. Nice depth to the mid-range and decent resolution. Similar to the Blon, maybe the Blon less so on resolution, but again, tonally, I think it's just a warmer, fuller mid-range, whereas I find the Starfield mid-range is a little bit, kind of comes into that V territory where, you know, the upper mid-range is pushed forward, but I think the lower mid-range gets a little bit recessed because of that. It gets a little bit tucked in behind the bass. Hiran Patel asking, if we bucket IEMs into working for different genres and types, what would they be? I know some talk about bass IEMs or female vocals. So I have a hard time with this this categorization of sound, right? Is by genre. Like, it doesn't work for me, and I don't have anything against people that can describe IEMs or headphones as being good for particular genres, but it doesn't work for me because I find that there's so much variation within a genre. Like, even a given artist's individual albums can sound better on some headphones than different albums, right? Like for example, I'll take Radiohead, right? Fairly well-known band. I think most of their music is, you know, relatively similarly produced and will sound similarly good on most headphones, but the album, I think it's called In Rainbows, I find is particularly bright. The mastering on that album is particularly bright and forward. And because of that, there's certain headphones and earphones that I would be glad to listen to the rest of Radiohead's library on that I wouldn't necessarily want to listen to that album on. And so that's why, like, I have a really hard time, you know, taking a generalization like this earphone is great for hip hop or something like that, when there's just so much variety in hip hop, there's so much variety in electronic that I personally am not good at making that kind of recommendation. Jerome saying, hey man, love your reviews. Quick question. I have the original T2 and the T4. I like the T2 better. Interesting. Will I get a different experience with the T2 Plus? So that's actually really interesting. It depends on what you liked better about the original T2. I think that this is probably, and this is actually, you know, one of the reasons why it's kind of surprising they called this the T2 Plus. I think this has more in common. It's honestly pretty different from both of them, frankly, but I think it has more in common with the T4 than it does with the original T2. And a lot of that, you know, comes down to bass quantity. I think the T4 has a nice sub bass emphasis, not a ton of sub bass, but for folks that were disappointed with the sub bass on the T2, the T4 kind of resolves that. I think that upper mid-range and treble, tonally wise, T4 and T2 are more similar, and this is, I think, more different. So it's hard for me to say. My personal preference between this and the T4, I think I generally prefer this actually. Tonally wise, I prefer the T4. The T4 is pretty bang on to my tonal preference, but it lacks a little bit in the definition and layering and the dimensionality to the sound. And I think the T2 Plus here does that better than even the T4. Personal preference. So if that hopefully answers your question. It's definitely not straightforward though. Man of Culture is asking, what would be my preference, my recommendation for an IEM with a V-shaped signature under $200? So I'm gonna go ahead and warn you straight up front, like V-shaped sound signature is typically not my preference. So take my recommendation with a grain of salt. I tend to gravitate toward IEMs that are a little bit more neutral, a little bit more flatter sound. And so because of that, there's just a lot of IEMs that are probably V-shaped that I've not gone out of my way to try because I don't expect that I'm gonna love it that much. So with that said, under 200 bucks, my favorite V-shaped IEM is probably the Eco OH10. I think that that's a really fun sounding IEM. Cost around, I think, 190 bucks, and the build quality on it is top. And I think sound signature wise, yeah, it's quite good. Its V is more, I would say that's actually that's a fairly strong V. It's got, you know, some upper mid-range emphasis. So the totality of vocals don't get sucked into the bottom of that V, but it's got a really nice treble air to it and definitely some sub bass focus. So I would go with that one. Shovik asking, can I recommend some good Japanese brand IEMs or non-Chinese IEMs, $200 to $300? So I don't have a ton of experience in this price range generally, or at least in my personal collection, I don't have a ton. The JVC FDX1, that's a Japanese brand. That is an outstanding sounding IEM. I love that IEM. I did a review of that one. You can still find it on drop, I think. It's come out in and out of availability, but I think that it is still possible to buy the FDX1. And for my money, you know, any IEMs that I've heard under like 500 bucks, it's like the FDX1 and the Moondrop Blessing 2. Moondrop Blessing, that is a Chinese IEM. I'm not sure what issue you have with that, but if you're looking for something that's not Chi-Fi, I think the JVC FDX1 is excellent. Maria Pialacqua is saying, I've heard that the SSR, the Moondrop SSR, is more female focused because the lady, basically talking about female vocals, right? So back to the SSR. That's another sort of generalization that I'm not very good with, is sort of the male vocals versus female vocals generalization. Because again, in my experience, like, male vocals are all over the place. Female vocals are all over the place, right? Is, you know, Tracy Chapman and Michael Jackson, right? That's a woman and a man with vocals that are probably on the opposite ends of what you would typically expect. So I have a hard time with that specific generalization. But what I can say is that generally, you know, what people associate with the upper mid-range frequencies in terms of vocals is female vocals, and that's what you do definitely get upper mid-range emphasis here with the SSR. So hopefully that answers your question, Maria. Diego Huerta asking, how much reverb does the T2 Plus have? I don't know that that's a term in my lexicon that I would necessarily apply. How in your mind, when you think about an IEM or a headphone having a reverby sound, how does that manifest? Because to me, reverby sounds like a term that I might use to describe maybe an echoiness, or like not a good thing, frankly. Like, to me, reverb inside of an earphone sounds like it's going to get in the way of the imaging and the definition in the sound. Maybe that's not how you mean it, but that's what it intuitively means to me, and I wouldn't say that I have that issue here with the T2 Plus. Waris asking, what's the next clear step up from the T2 Plus in performance? Yikes. That's a really hard question to answer, because it really depends on your preferences. Like, for me, let's say I'm spending my own money, right? And I got $60 to spend, there's a very good chance I'll go with this. If I'm gonna spend, if I'm looking for an upgrade, you know, it depends on what I'm looking for. Like, the thing that I will have my eye on is still gonna be the Maga OC-K5, which is $150, so it's not a cheap upgrade. If you're looking for an upgrade that's maybe a little bit cheaper, maybe the Etymotic ER2 XR is probably where I would say the next step up is. I actually think that the ER2 XR has got a little bit too much bass emphasis, and in comparison to this, it does make it slightly, I think the stages and images better because it doesn't have quite that same bass issue as the ER2 XR, but generally I prefer the mid-range on the ER2. And I also don't have any issues with sibilance with the ER2. So the ER2 XR is probably my next step up from this in terms of price, but it's about twice as much as this. So I guess it kind of goes to show you how good this thing is. Blank the regular otaku asking, does the SSR sound like the Tin P1s? And in my opinion, no, not really. The P1s, I think there might be a characteristic to the sound that you could draw a line between this and the P1s, but I think it's a little bit hard to describe. It's kind of just like an organic character. Yeah, it's not great for me. I'm not going to do a great job of describing it. There is maybe a potential line there, but mostly, no. I think that these things tonally are quite different. I think these things have a lot more bass emphasis than what you get on the P1. I think the mid-range on the P1 outshines the mid-range here. And then treble on the P1 is slightly on the dark side, but with a hint of air, whereas this is kind of the opposite, slightly on the bright side without a ton of air. But I don't find that the lack of air is actually an issue here. I think that dimensionally, these things come across quite well. But yeah, not too similar to the P1 in my opinion. JS Petrolina asking, hey, from Brazil, how's it going, Brazil? Have I ever tried the shower tape? And if so, did I like it? I haven't tried the tape, actually. I saw that a lot of people were pretty into the shower tape, and I kind of missed that boat. And so when they came out with a new IM, the Singer, I went ahead and ordered that for myself. And you didn't see a review of that IM because very immediately I did not like that one. Was not that into the Shower Singer. I have no idea if the tape sounds anything like that, but the Singer I did not like. It was just all upper mids and all sub bass and not much else. Kind of honky sounding actually too. Arctic Viper asking, how does this compare to the KZ ZS-10 Pros? My personal preference is by far gonna be for the T2 Plus. The ZS-10 Pro I think was, a pretty nicely balanced IM, tonally pretty good. I think it also had some, upper or some lower treble sibilance issues, maybe more mid treble sibilance issues. I think that the treble on the ZS-10 Pro from memory, I didn't do a head-to-head comparison, but from memory, I found it to be more troublesome than the treble here, just to kind of set your own barometer. That's probably a bunch of mixed metaphors, but anyway, so there's that. But just tonally wise, I prefer this. I found that the ZS-10 Pro tonally, it is a bit on the mainstreamy sound, and just kind of like the Starfield. It's the lower mid-range just kind of gets lost a little bit for my personal tastes. Salsa Man, what IM would I wholeheartedly recommend? You think I'm half-heartedly recommending this one? I don't know, any IM without any caveats, I don't think that one exists, frankly. Closest would probably be the Moondrop Blessing 2. The only caveat there is that if you've got small ears, that one's gonna be a problem for you, but otherwise, that sound-wise is just about perfect for me. I'm gonna have to wrap this one up pretty soon because it sounds like dinner is ready. But I will catch up with chat real quick. Papeg asking, am I going to review the K-Bear KS2? I don't think so. I wasn't planning to, so probably not. Optato saying the Singer is significantly worse than the tape, but the tape is pretty upper mid-rangey as well. So interestingly, yeah, I've compared graphs. I think Critical has graphs of both the tape and the Singer, and frequency response wise, they seem like there's some similarities between them, but I definitely can't imagine what I'm hearing in the Singer being what other people are praising so much about the tape. So there's got to be something more to it than just the frequency response. Micah Sheldon saying this has less to do with headphones and more to do with amps DACs. That's totally fine. I don't know much about any of the equipment. What is the best portable amp DAC that I can get without breaking the bank? So I haven't spent a lot of time, frankly, with portable amp DACs unless you count something like, an Apple dongle or a Meizu dongle. If you've got an Android phone, the dongle, I've got a few dongles. The one that I would recommend is the Meizu Hi-Fi Pro. Cost around 40, 50 bucks, something like that. And I get very, very nice, clean sound out of it. You're not gonna get a ton of volume out of, for like really high demanding headphones, but for IEMs, that's perfectly fine. I think you will be completely satisfied with that. If you're on iPhone, just the Apple dongle, honestly, is a high quality sound. Again, you're not gonna get a ton of volume out of it, but for most headphones, including even like the COS 60 ohm stuff, that's gonna get plenty loud out of these dongles, and IEMs are gonna be no problem whatsoever. Jerome saying, thanks for answering, looking forward to more reviews, and I think that is a good opportunity for me to end this live stream. Thank you all for watching. Again, I appreciate the live chat. I appreciate all the questions. You guys make this stuff interesting, not just for other people, but for me as well. If you've liked this video up to this point, please hit the like button. It helps people find this video and others like it. You can subscribe to the channel, ding the bell. You'll get alerted to the next time I go live. And I'll see you on the next Super Radio. Cheers, guys.